A Duvid here, Thursday morning stream with Kevin Barrett, interesting guest I've spoken to on his channel before. I met through Adam Green, and I guess a pretty prominent writer, professor, Western American convert to Islam, and also various theories, been on Fox News and other radio and blogging, and currently now is regular on Press TV. A lot of insight on international politics, possibly theories about 9/11 or what would be classically called conspiracy theory. But I was interested to talk to Kevin about his conversion to Islam, his political, his academic career, his research and writing. So let me turn it over to Kevin, and feel free to give whatever bio you want.
Well, hey, David, it's great to be on your channel. I enjoyed our previous conversations very much. So I guess, yeah, you're interested in how did a nice, normal Midwestern white boy turn into a radical Muslim conspiracy theorist, which is pretty much the reputation I have in the mainstream these days. Certainly the reputation that Fox News tried to pin on me in 2006 with some success, because I can't work in the Western Academy anymore. My name is toxic. You Google me and you find all kinds of stuff, like the ADL has put out about a dozen fatwas against me, most recently just a couple of weeks ago, where I made their list of like the top 6 supposed anti-Semitic threats, along with your friend Adam Green. No, actually he was left out this time. E. Michael Jones and other people like that. So anyway, I've had an interesting trajectory there, from wanting to be a writer when I was a teenager and having spiritual experiences, but having come out of a lapsed Unitarian background, which is as lapsed as it gets. My parents dragged me to the Unitarian Church only a couple of times in my childhood. And so I got interested in writing and language and literature. I collected 3 master's degrees in French and English literature and humanities. And then I encountered some interesting mystical writings by way of actually a guy from a Jewish background, Jacob Needleman. I don't know if you know about Jacob Needleman, but he's the editor of the Penguin Arcana series on spirituality, and he was teaching at San Francisco State. I was looking for a class on teaching of English composition. I wandered into the wrong class, Jacob Needleman's class on Kabbalah, and I got hooked. Most of the writings we were assigned to read were by traditionalists, people like Guénon, Chouon. These were Europeans who were basically Sufi Muslims, who said the only salvation for Europe is in mystical Islam. And there were a few, of course, who went in other directions, such as Hinduism. Guénon had a lot of respect for Hinduism as well. But in any case, after I encountered those guys, I was primed to suddenly see that this idea of God could make sense. Before that, I was doing Buddhist sitting. The whole notion of God, an anthropomorphic God, struck me as absurd. Just as
I've actually been reading through the compiled works of Rene Guénon quickly on archive.com, like I think all 15 or 20 of his books, and I finished about a third of them, and they're pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's rejected modernity, and both technological progressivist modernity, this notion that everything's getting better all the time because of wonderful technological and scientific progress, and the more we lose our spirituality and religion, the better. And so let's get into this new modern age of machines and forget about our souls. That's kind of the dominant worldview of the West over the past century and a half.
He's more pro-Hindu than Islam. I mean, his critiques on the West might be valid from either perspective, but I thought he was basically a Hindu.
No, he was a Muslim. Guénon converted to Islam. He reached a lot of his insights through Hindu or proto-Hindu, sort of Upanishad-style monotheistic philosophy, but he became a Muslim. He converted to Islam, took Shahada, moved to Egypt, lived with his Muslim wife in a Muslim community, prayed 5 times a day, went to his local mosque. He did that for the last couple of decades of his life. And he urged his followers also to convert to Islam, although he left open the possibility of Hinduism or other traditional religion. But he did believe that Islam was the salvation of the West, the best preserved of the authentic revelations. So anyway, I encountered that, and I encountered his rejection not only of technological modernity, but also of the kind of bogus spirituality that goes with it, which is Freemasonry and Satanism. That's what passes for esotericism, is largely this satanic deviation that people discover the spiritual realm, and then they want power, and they want money, and they want pleasure, and they start manipulating things spiritually, doing black magic. And that's what Freemasonry does for the most part. He dabbled in Freemasonry. He saw the spiritual world. He saw what the people in Freemasonry were doing in the spiritual world, using Kabbalah to get sex and money and power, and to blackmail people. Jeffrey Epstein and his friends, they dabble in Kabbalah, believe it or not. The people that did 9/11 dabble.
We could argue about this later, but I mean,
okay. I'm not saying everybody in Kabbalah does that. Like I said, I came to Islam from Kabbalah in a sense.
I agree with you that Freemasonry largely has been corrupted, but at least as a venerable religion, generally I would defend Freemasonry historically, and I would claim that even much of Islam, organizational Islam, was structured around Freemasonic principles, but it doesn't change your point about the large corruption of Freemasonry in the modern West.
Well, I do think that there's esotericism per se has problems, and I suppose that just as there have been Freemasons who were trying to do the best they could, and the deists who founded the United States of America were trying to do what a good God would do if a good God were still involved in the world, but they believed as deists that God had created the world and taken a hike. But once you accept that, and accept that you're the one playing God, then you're going down a bad path, the same path that everybody, whether they start out in Catholicism or Islam or Judaism or whatever, and they start doing black magic, they start seeking wealth and power and money, or whatever, playing games with malevolent jinn or other bad entities, rather than seeking the truth and purifying their souls and their hearts and surrendering completely to God, which is what all true spirituality is all about, then they're going down the wrong path. And Godon saw this, and so that blew my mind, because before that I'd been brainwashed by this secular progressivist kind of milieu in the academy. And so ever since then, I've been on the path to Islam, and I've been practicing pretty rigorously for a couple of decades now. And it was in 2006, my career trajectory changed from being interested in medieval Sufism and miracle stories in saints' legends to talking about false flag events and political scandals. And I didn't really make that change intentionally. It just happened because after I got involved in the 9/11 Truth Movement, Fox News dragged me on and tried to make an example of me to scare away the other professors from going into 9/11 Truth. So I've been following the path of the Malamatiya Sufis, that is the Sufis who speak truth to power and don't care what anybody thinks about them, ever since.
Was that more intellectual, like you came across their literature, or was there a period where you actually met followers and joined them for worship and decided that you wanted to join that lifestyle or movement? Or are you saying it was more intellectual, or you just read about it in literature?
You're talking about Islam, Malamatiya, or the Truth Movement? Three different things.
Well, I guess all of them. I was thinking more Islam, but
yeah,
I guess all of those.
Well, I formally converted to Islam in 1993. And I was, as I said, primed by reading the traditionalists in Jacob Needleman's classroom at San Francisco State. And then I had a number of experiences.
Formally converted means through
it took Shahada. You say, no God but God, and Muhammad's a prophet.
But is it through like a recognized hierarchical structure that is centered in the Middle East? Or are you just saying your local mosque, you went and said the Shahada and you were a Muslim, and it wasn't
you just get a couple of witnesses and you say no God but God and Muhammad's his prophet, and you're a Muslim.
Yeah, I mean, classically that's the way Jewish conversion worked, and then certainly over the last few decades or even hundreds of years, it became a centralized process where there has to be some central committee that approves it. And I don't know in Islam if you wanted to make Hajj to Mecca or something, or get citizenship in another country, if you'd have to go through a more like verification, or you say Muslims keep the conversion relatively simple. You just need a few witnesses and to say the Shahada.
It's the latter. Very simple. Few witnesses, say the Shahada. Now, if you went to Mecca immediately after taking Shahada and you didn't know anything at all about Islam, including you didn't know how to pray and stuff, you might have an issue because, people might, I don't know who the people would be, but maybe the authorities there, when you got there, if it was obvious that you didn't have a clue about how to recite enough Quran to be able to pray and so on, maybe they would take you aside and teach you the minimal amount you would need to know to pray properly. But no, it's really simple. And that's, I think, one of the reasons maybe that Islam has spread so fast and so far.
Is that universal among Shia, Sunni, Wahhabi? All of them will just don't have this hierarchical, rigorous conversion process?
I don't think anybody does. I think that maybe some Shia groups might be a little bit more sort of rigorous in the way that I know that there are some people who talk about some sort of formal conversion to Shia Islam that somebody may have done, whether coming from Sunni Islam or another religious background. But I don't think so. I think basically in all of Islam, you take Shahada and you are considered a full-fledged Muslim.
Yeah, we discussed this in a previous talk, right? Is generally Sharia law is Abrahamic law and pretty close to what you see in the Talmud or the scriptures of Moses. So, like it's in the Talmud, that's pretty similar to the process of becoming a Jew. You only need 2 adult kosher witnesses. You don't even need respected rabbis. So anyone could join the Jewish people just by finding 2 or 3, I think it's 3 upstanding male members of the Jewish community, and then they're converted. But over the last few hundred years, that's changed into a rigorous conversion process. And now, like, Israel has state-sponsored rabbis, and they have lists of there's only tens of rabbis across the U.S. that can officially do conversions, and they're always dispelling and refuting rabbis doing fake conversions. So it's interesting that Islam never went down that hole that Israel's down right now.
Well, there's a reason for that, although I suppose there probably are similar reasons in Judaism that have gotten lost. But in Islam, what is Islam? Islam, the word means surrender to God, but the revelations that came through Prophet Muhammad, the seal of the prophets, the Khatim al-Nabiyyin, he's the one who brought this kind of final revelation that clarifies and dispels the misconceptions of the earlier revelations. And among the many corrections that Islam makes, many of them very light corrections on the received monotheistic tradition, is this notion of priestcraft. That is, Islam, especially in its kind of majority Sunni interpretation, absolutely rejects all forms of priesthood or rabbinate or any other kind of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. That is, all Muslim believers are basically on the same plane. We are all human beings submitting to God, doing our best to submit to God. Anybody can lead the prayer. Now, if somebody's a horrible sinner, maybe you wouldn't want them to. But, when my kids were growing up, when my kids got to be like 6, 7, 8, old enough to lead the prayer, once or twice they did it, right? So anybody can lead the prayer. So the imam, the word imam, basically just means whoever happens to be leading the prayer. So there's this absolute equality of believers before God. God is so exalted that all humans are basically equally in a position of absolute submission, unless they're in abject rebellion, which is precisely what you shouldn't be doing. So that equality eliminates all religious bureaucracy. So for Muslims, the structure of rabbis is absolutely wrong. There should be no such thing. There absolutely should be no authority in Judaism that can tell you if you're a Jew or not. That's ridiculous. You should be submitting to God. And if you purify yourself enough and you really submit to God, you are a better Jew than whoever the head rabbi of whatever school of Judaism, who is still in his ego, right? And likewise with the idea of popes and bishops and so on, that you can see how that's caused so much trouble for Christianity. They're so egotistical. Whoever wants power gets away from spirituality, and these religious bureaucracies become a vehicle for power. So Islam wipes the slate clean of all forms of formal religious hierarchy and bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't want to get too diverted from you finishing your bio, but I did like a 6-hour stream on going over academic research to show the evolution of the conversion process to Judaism and the different disputes between the schools. But obviously, not Islam. You do have a caliphate and a hierarchical structure of clerics, and I guess within the classical Talmudic Judaism, you had a central body like a Sanhedrin, but there were certain laws that just any 3 upstanding people in your community were good enough for. It gave no benefit to go, pardon me, to the main court. Then there would be certain judgments like capital offenses that would have required a bigger court of like 21 people. And so it would have been loosely centralized, but something like conversion wouldn't have required one of the main court. Any 3 upstanding men in an area could have done that. But and I'm not sure if Islam works similarly, where there's like a division of power where certain things could just be decided by any upstanding men in the community. Certain things take an actual clerical court of a certain body or size or power.
Well, no. See, the way Islamic scholarship and law works is pretty informal for the most part. Now, there may be a few exceptions, especially in today's world, where, for instance, in Iran, there are various sort of more or less formal hierarchies within the Shia clergy. But traditionally, the way Islamic law worked and scholarship, which are really the same thing, what the law, if you want to know how to behave, or if you want to resolve a dispute, you need to go to a scholar who knows what the correct thing is, who can make the right judgment. So who do you go to? Well, scholarship works very much the way it works in the academy in the West, or the way it's supposed to work, which is that it's all about mutual recognition, but there's nothing formal. Like who's the greatest scholar today in the field of nanotechnology or whatever? Pick some field, and how do you find out? Well, you ask the scholars, and the scholars will not even fully agree. Some will say Noam Chomsky is the greatest linguist. Others say Chomsky, he's a fraud. He's not a good linguist. He's a scam. This sort of thing. They'll argue. There's no official hierarchy or bureaucracy that sets things out in stone. That's how it is in Islamic scholarship and law. So if you have a dispute to resolve in traditional Islam, you just try to find somebody who knows more than you do about the Quran and the Hadith, the scripture, and if their answer doesn't satisfy you, you try to find somebody who knows more than that person did. And traditionally, this led to these 4 different major Sunni law schools and 1 major Shia law school. And it's a plurality of law schools. And the litigants are always free to go whichever law school they want. And there's nobody who agrees about which scholar is more, higher up a hierarchy than any other scholar. It's all informal. Again, as I'm saying, Islam wipes the slate clean of formal religious hierarchy and bureaucracy, period.
Well, have you read Kevin McDonald's Culture Critique series on the group evolutionary strategy?
I've read some of it, yeah. And I've had him on my radio show talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask you about your trip, and I'm thinking, like, at some point, is it more intellectual? Are you becoming more and more affiliated with a group that centers from the Middle East, or are you on a journey with similar like-minded Westerners that are also on this journey? And I brought up Kevin McDonald to look at like group strategy. If you wanted from a secular position to say you're just like Judaism, somewhat a group strategy of the Jews, whether people believe in it or not, that Islam has become a group strategy of Arabs, or a group strategy of sections of maybe even darker skinned people in general, so that when you come on to Islam, you're basically participating in a group strategy that's not your own. And I know religiously that's not the way you look at it, because religiously Islam is about the single God, and the religion is applicable to everybody on earth. But then there is the certain element of a group strategy, and how does that apply to your conversion process? Are you spending your initial days just with books and a handful of Westerners that are also interested, or do you get caught up with like a Sufi sect and you start joining their community?
Well, joining a Sufi sect wouldn't be much of a group evolutionary strategy. I don't see how anybody would be sort of outbreeding anybody else in a Darwinian sense and winning the struggle for material survival
Well,
by
just the organizational
persevering.
principle that society chose, from like an anthropological approach towards religion, that whatever reason, this group of people came up with this strategy for dealing with the world, and the various religions have an ethnic component because they were derived from some sort of strategy that was evolved by the group that created it.
Yeah, and I think that Kevin McDonald's analysis works very well for Judaism, because Judaism is very endogamous. There has been this principle of endogamy in Judaism. And I actually translated a book by Lauren Guyeno called From Yahweh to Zion that does quote McDonald a little bit and looks at Judaism in that sort of light. But I don't think that's as easy a thing to do with Islam. I think McDonald would have a very hard time if he honestly studied Islam and tried to apply his Darwinian thought. It wouldn't work very well, because
what about
Islam,
the nation of Islam? And like I just remember from the famous movie with Denzel Washington, but Elijah Muhammad tells Malcolm X, Islam is the only religion that addresses the need of dark-skinned people in America. And something like that, as a group strategy, you could say, well, Islam pretty well addresses the need of dark-skinned people in America. And then you look at yourself, okay, well, you're not a dark-skinned person. Is Islam addressing your needs? And you say, oh, well, maybe Christianity, these other religions don't really address the needs of your various groups. And you're saying, well, that has, obviously, according to Islam, that has to be heretical, because Islam, being true, would be a monotheistic religion. But certainly there's that element like Nation of Islam where Islam could be a vehicle to address a certain ethnic group's struggles within society.
well, that's true. That's what the Nation of Islam originally was, but that's its deviation from real Islam. The original, Nation of Islam grew out of American slaves. 1/3, some say a quarter, but a lot of the Africans brought in slavery to the Americas were Muslim, and they weren't allowed to practice. And so it went underground, and then it reemerged about the beginning of the 20th century as these things like the Moorish Orthodox Church and the Nation of Islam, these black nationalist kinds of expressions. But precisely to the extent that these expressions were pursuing a group evolutionary strategy or defending a particular ethnicity, they were deviations from real Islam, which is absolutely universal. And to the extent that Islam is fostering any kind of group evolutionary strategy, it would be the group called humanity. And that's what Islam really can offer humanity. As Malcolm X discovered, Islam is not a vehicle for dark-skinned people. Islam is a vehicle for everybody. Some of the greatest expressions of Islam historically have been from white people in Europe. Islamic Spain was primarily white people in Europe. It was the highest civilization probably in Islamic history, many say anyway. Maria Menacal's, an American scholar, says it was the highest civilization yet in world history, much higher than anything that has come since in European modernity, and much more tolerant and broad-minded as well. That was European Islam in Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain. And Eastern Europe and Southern Europe was also massively Muslim, and still is to a great extent, especially the literate classes, the educated people in that part of Europe were primarily Muslim. And it was the kind of the uneducated rural peasant types who weren't for a long time. Islam has a long history in Europe as well as in Africa, Asia, all over the world. And that's what Islam offers today, is a way for people to get to the truth of who we are and why were we created, what are we doing here on earth as human beings. So it's not about any one group over the other. On the contrary, of course, that always is going to creep in, people being tormented by their nafs, or their ego, the nafs al-amra bisu, the ego that commands evil, arises within all of us and says, I am better than you, I am better than he. That was Satan's sin, the shaitan, a'udhu billah, the devil. His first sin was to say, I am better than you. And this corruption of thinking that my way is better than your way, my skin is better than your skin, whatever, that egotism is the basic human failing. And when we fully submit to God in Islam, we become equal believers in absolute submission to God. And we need to struggle against this tendency to use Islam and misuse it in this really disgusting and heretical way to try to further our egotistical ends, whether it's individual or whether it's group. That's not what it's about.
Yeah, I generally agree with you, but I was saying, I think from a geopolitical aspect, even historically, even biblically, from a Judeo interpretation of the Bible, where you have Ishmael, you kind of being like the dominant prophet, leader of nations among the Semitic people, and then Esav developing to be the leading your personality among European peoples, or the the various your prophecies in the books of Moses to Abraham and his children, and then incorporated till modern today. Even President Trump, certainly Bush, and when you were probably going through your intellectual evolution, where a majority of the Western leaders looked at it as this kind of intrinsic battle between Europeans, the white man holding the banner of Christianity, and Middle Easterners, Africans, dark-skinned people holding the banner of Islam. And even though me and you both disagree with that narrative, I mean, certainly that would appear to be the dominant narrative, at least among the neocons, and maybe even to the West in general, or maybe even parts of the Middle East, where even in among Muslim countries, that they also see this greater narrative of Christianity in the European man and Islam in the Semitic man.
Well, historically, it just so happened that the era of modern technology progressed fastest in Europe. The best two explanations for that are the invention of the Gutenberg press in Europe, which radically changed mentalities and made technology more possible. And then the fact that Europe was broken up into these little feuding kingdoms. And so they were constantly fighting each other, and they were constantly working hard to develop better weapons. And so Europe it got some mass literacy, and it got better weapons. And so it conquered the entire world in the 17th, 18th, and especially 19th centuries. And in doing so, it perpetrated by far the worst Holocaust that's ever happened. 100 million, well over 100 million people murdered in this European conquest of the world. Well, much of the world that was conquered was Muslim majority. And so that has led to this dynamic today of Islam being identified with a sort of third world justice movement. And
the Crusades, I mean, obviously the first Crusades, the Battle of Constantinople and Spain happened well before the rise of Europe, that there was already this kind of defending the ethnic borders where, this side of the border is Christian and European, and this side of the border is Islam and darker skinned people. I mean, certainly that probably goes back to
no, I don't agree.
Before the Crusades, or some of the first battles over Constantinople. Or
I don't think it was about skin color in those days. Everybody had
a group strategy. I don't necessarily mean skin color.
Everybody had slaves, and the slaves had all different skin colors. The word slave is a cognate with Slav, because a lot of Slavic peoples were taken into slavery. And but as far as Christianity being identified with Europe, that really wasn't the case. In some smaller areas, it may have been. Like if you were living sort of in what's now sort of middle to southern France or Spain, and at the time when there was a century there where the Spanish Muslims looked like they were likely to conquer all of Europe. And so, yeah, at that point, there would have been this sort of Christian versus Muslim identity and tension. But for the most part, Christianity has actually been as Eastern as Western. And Rome didn't fall at the time we're told. Rome continued right up until the fall of Constantinople in around 1450. So this idea of East and West and Europe versus Islam is actually quite wrong. There's been a tremendous thriving Christianity in the Muslim majority lands, many of them anyway, throughout the Middle East and North Africa, right up until today. And that Eastern Christianity, many people, including the Russians, will tell you is the real Christianity. Western Christianity was just a bunch of barbarians who followed this crazy pope who led a rebellion against the real Christians and led a huge schism. And it just so happened that these barbarians on the northwest fringes of Europe ended up taking over the world by the two processes I just mentioned, the Gutenberg press and the fact that they were fighting with each other so much, being barbarians, that they developed really powerful weapons.
So we're going to get into the complete evolution of your thought, and I guess it's going to come down to, so you're saying this modern, like President Bush, New World Order, Fox News, neocon was relatively recent creation in the West for political purposes, to kind of politicize these international differences for political purposes, but somehow that's dominated elements of the neocon Republican narrative. Presumably President Trump, Fox News largely follow this narrative.
Sure. I mean, of course, as I said, from the 19th century onward, there was a sort of a advanced, wealthy West and North America versus the Third World, and colonization and imperialism was one split, between the First World and the Third World. But don't forget about the Second World, which was the godless communists. Right up until 9/11, or at least until 1990, and it didn't really change until 9/11, the real political split was, at least for Americans and Western Europeans, was between the godless communists and the people who still worship God, which is the West, and the Muslims. The Muslims and the West were seen as being on the same side right up until 9/11. And the communists were the enemy. That's the world I grew up in. I was born in 1959. And throughout my upbringing, the Muslims were always us. They were people who worship God like we did. Now, there was anti-Muslim propaganda coming from the Zionists in Hollywood and things like that. But the basic political dynamic was that Islam leaned towards being on the side of the West in its existential struggle with the godless communists.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're saying at your journey in the 90s, and I guess at some point you become a full professor, and you're noticing, through your transformation and becoming a Muslim and looking at the world through the religious lens of the new truth you found, that you start realizing the propaganda and the lies that are widespread in academia, in news and political circles.
Oh, yeah. Although I knew about those lies.
Before 9/11, or was 9/11, or you're saying there in the 90s already, you start turning on the news and listening to the politicians and realizing like they're not telling us the truth, they're feeding us a false narrative? Or does it happen after 9/11?
No, I'm smart enough that I knew that they were lying to us a lot of the time, long before 9/11. I mean, come on. First when I was 13 or 14, I woke up and realized that I'd been cheering for the Americans in Vietnam. And then I started reading a little bit and learning about, wow, we're on the wrong side here, to say the least. We're committing just this atrocity, this Holocaust of millions of Vietnamese in a war of aggression. It's just absolutely evil. So I understood that my country was doing just, beyond evil. My country during the Vietnam era was the equivalent of Nazi Germany, waging an aggressive war and killing millions of innocent people. And I knew that from the time I was 13 or 14. And then when I was, 15 or 16, I went to see Mark Lane give a talk about the JFK assassination. This would have been in about 1970, early 70s, maybe 73 or 74, right when the Zapruder film had been first revealed. And that was a life-changing experience. Not only did I realize that my country was committing a Holocaust in Vietnam, but my country was ruled by people of such evil that they would murder a president and then presumably murder lots of other people to cover it up, all to pursue greater evil. I mean, this level of evil in my country was off the charts, and I knew that from the time I was 15. So it wasn't exactly a shock to me, really. When 9/11 happened, my first thought was that, it's quite likely that this isn't really, that this official story is way too Hollywood. That's certainly, almost certainly not what really happened. But we'll probably never know what the truth is, because whoever did this probably was able to do it well enough that we'll never be able to prove it. So I kind of went back to sleep for a few years and didn't pay much attention. And then in late 2003, I heard David Ray Griffin, who is one of the most brilliant philosophers in the world, was looking at 9/11 and saying, this looks like a false flag. They blew up the Twin Towers with explosives. They didn't just fall down from office fires. And the Pentagon something happened to it that wasn't a hijacked plane hitting it. So I looked into that and found that David Ray Griffin was right. And that was a shock to me. I mean, I'd already known about all these other things, and I knew that the United States foreign policy has been just supremely evil, at least since World War II, if not before. But I didn't realize that they could pull off something like that, just blow up the World Trade Center in broad daylight. Anybody with eyes and a 5th grade science education can see in about 2 minutes that these buildings were blown up. They didn't just fall down from office fires. And the fact that they could do that and get everybody to lie about it and get the media to lie about it, the fact that the media is so controlled by these forces of evil, just slapped me in the face. And I said, I've got to do something about this. I don't want to spend the next 7 years fighting for tenure in a university and have to keep my mouth shut about this. So even though I didn't have tenure, I started doing teach-ins and joined Scholars for 9/11 Truth. And then I was selected as the whipping boy of the neocons to try to scare off the other professors. And that's where my career trajectory changed from medieval Sufi scholar to whatever I am now.
You think, let's say theoretically, had you not converted to Islam, would you still have felt the same way? Or was there a connection between, let's say, giving you the benefit of the doubt? And I'm generally lenient in a believer in, we'll call conspiracy theories, and that what they're telling us isn't the truth, and you have to dig behind to try to figure out for yourself. But that you would have came to the same conclusions independent of Islam, or is Islam part of the process of you coming to these conclusions?
Well, I think I probably would have come to the same conclusions eventually, because, as I said, I got interested in the JFK assassination in high school and read about that quite a bit right up through the 1990s. And actually, if I hadn't been in the university studying Islamic studies at the time 9/11 happened, I might very well have figured out the truth much more quickly, because I was so busy finishing my PhD at the time and learning Arabic that I just didn't feel like I had the time to pay that much attention to it for a couple of years until I heard about Dr. Griffin's work. So I think I probably would have figured it out. And in fact, it's interesting, in Madison, Wisconsin, where I was living and going to school when 9/11 happened, I was the only Muslim I knew. I ran into every Muslim I talked to right after that said, "Oh, come on, can you really believe this? Do they expect anybody to believe this official story? This is insane." This is what every single Muslim I talked to, they ranged from skeptical to derisive about the official story of 9/11 from the moment it happened. And some of this was backed up by, all sorts of evidence. The top Pakistani General Gul says just a week afterwards, U.S. Air Force and the Zionists did this. Mohammed Hakel, the most prestigious commentator out of Egypt, says, when I was in the Egyptian government, I was part of infiltrating Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is just a cat's paw for intelligence agencies. There's no such thing as an independent group called Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth. So all the Muslims knew this right away. And I said, I was the only one who didn't go along with that. I said, yeah, well, you're probably right, but we'll never really know. Let's just wait and see, what information comes in. So I was kind of the anti-truther in the Muslim community during the 2 years after 9/11. But because the world Muslim community got this immediately, 80% of Muslims have always said it was an inside job from day one, and still say that, it's easier, I guess, to sort of be in that community and to see the truth, because the majority of the community sees it that way. And so it must be harder for people who aren't in the Islamic community, perhaps. I don't know.
Well, and the narrative is being used against you. We talk about the group strategy. So you as a European blooded convert to Islam, the narrative, however false it is, isn't being used against your ethnic brethren as opposed to your average Muslim. This narrative not only, say it's false, it's being used to harm their ethnic brethren.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe it's being used to harm your religious brethren, but not your ethnic brethren.
I don't know what ethnic brethren. The whole notion of ethnic brethren doesn't really cut it for me. I mean, my wife is Moroccan, and her background includes Arab Moroccans, Berber Moroccans, Armenians. Her last name is from Armenia by way of Baluchistan. Her grandfather or great-grandfather immigrated. One of her grandmothers or great-grandmothers or whatever is Black African, and so on and so forth. And she's got European blood as well. So it's, I don't know what, so my kids have all of that, and plus whatever I am. And I'm sort of a Northwestern European mongrel with DNA through, the British Isles and Germany, but a little bit of other places as well, going into Russia and Asiatic Russia, according to somebody my grandmother got involved in looking at genealogy. So I don't really think of myself as some, ethnic character from one little part of the world who's defending all the people with the same genes from that. What a stupid way to see yourself. I mean, to me,
there's not scientific accuracy to say that people feel more pain when they see someone of their own ethnicity suffer than when they see someone of another ethnicity suffer. And I think there's been some reasonable scientific studies to demonstrate that there is that natural tendency.
Indeed. But that is exactly the egotistical natural tendency that we have to repel within ourselves. That's what we're here for, David. That's why God created us. We're in a test. Life is a moral, ethical, and spiritual test to see if we can overcome the nefs al-amara bisu, the ego that commands evil, and rise above it. And that means that when you're walking down the street on a beautiful summer day, and all of these half-dressed naked women walk past you from a college campus, they're young ones, you don't figure out how to seduce and or rape them because maybe your nafs al-amra bisu is telling you to do that, but you say, wait a minute, I have conscious being, and I know that would hurt them and a lot of other people, and cause all of this suffering and pain, and it would be following the negativity within me, and so I'm not going to do that. And nor am I going to, I'm smart enough. I could figure out how to become a very wealthy criminal if I wanted to. But, and at some point in my life, I seriously kind of thought about that. But at another point in my life, I recognized that that's not the right way to go. And likewise, that individual egotism, me, I want more, the hell with everybody else. Group egotism is just like that too. It's just as evil to be a group egotist as to be an individual egotist. So get over it.
Well, I mean, you're coming to these conclusions at a time like, I remember President Bush, and it was constantly, it's a war of good and evil, and you're either with us or against us. And, it would appear that, basically, God forbid, all of the people that are against us are Muslim, according to, the narrative of President Bush, even though he says it's not a war against Islam, but just looking at all of the, the people that are supposedly our enemies and bad guys are basically all Muslim.
Right. And of course, 9/11 was designed to make that transition from the Cold War world with the communist enemy, the godless communist enemy, to the post 9/11 world with the Muslim enemy, the God-fearing Muslim enemy. So now we're all atheists. Now we hate the people who worship God. Now we make the transgender reading to school children our saint, our wisdom teacher is the gender confused, sexually depraved individual who reads to school children. We're in a whole new world, and that's what 9/11 was designed to do. It was designed to take us from being at war with the godless communists to put us at war with religion in general, and the most persistent and vibrant and, dare I say, true religion in particular. That's what 9/11 was all about.
If you just look at motive, obviously Zionist motives in terms of Russia, who had possibly historically been anti-Israel, starts becoming pro-Israel. Israel, starts building, 2004. I think the, God forbid, the apartheid wall, and the policy that America is taking of President Bush pretty clearly is, say relatively, beneficial to Israel Zionism, where it appears that the West is fighting the wars on behalf of Israel, and especially the switch of, what you mentioned, the Cold War against Russia, where Russia, I don't want to say becomes salvaged by becoming pro-Israel and, joining the fight on terrorism.
Well, yeah, I think there, different people probably helped perpetrate and cover up 9/11 for various reasons. It was sold to the U.S. strategic establishment as a new Pearl Harbor that would enable a, quote, new American century. The Project for a New American Century actually called for that very new Pearl Harbor exactly 1 year before it happened in their book, Rebuilding America's Defenses, published in September of 2000. So at one level, 9/11 was designed to supposedly ensure that the U.S. empire would continue to reign supreme for another century by doubling the military budget, enabling preemptive wars, getting rid of the constitutional protections that were getting in the way of Spartan military supremacy. That's one level. But at another level, I think it was the culmination of the vision of Rabbi Abarbanel that was then taken up by people like Shabtai Zvi and Jacob Frank. That is, these heretical Satanists or whatever, who spun off from Orthodox Judaism and were no longer Orthodox. I would say they're heretical, but you're a better judge than I am. And went into black magic Kabbalah, got into the organized crime rackets of things like usury banking, got tremendous power in the world, planted a so-called Jewish colony in Palestine, in the Holy Land. Rabbi Abarbanel's vision was to ultimately bring on the Messiah to rule the world from Jerusalem, and put the Jews above everybody else, a Jewish supremacist global state ruled by the supposed Messiah. Rabbi Abarbanel's vision was to achieve this by way of an apocalyptic war between the Christians and the Muslims that would ruin both the Christians and the Muslims, and allow the Jewish Messiah, a military conqueror, to rule the world from Jerusalem. And he thought he was that Messiah. Well, he was a little early, but Netanyahu's father, the leading academic expert on him, on Abarbanel, professor at Princeton, basically says in his book on Abarbanel that Abarbanel was just 500 years too early. He thought that it was going to happen through supernatural means. He didn't realize it would take generations and generations of patient strategic planning to make it happen. So that's another level of 9/11, the level of greater Israel, driven by these satanic, heretical, messianic, millenarian ideologies.
Relatively, the Jewish community doesn't consider Abarbanel heretical. He's I don't know, like Maimonides, but he's basically as accepted as Maimonides. In fact, most they call it the Mikras Gedolos, like a compendium of the most famous commentators on the Bible, and that almost always includes the Abarbanel.
And I'm confused about that, because as I understood it, in real Orthodox Judaism, Jews are not allowed to even lift a hand, not even lift a little finger to go back to the Holy Land. That's going to happen when God decrees it. God makes it happen. And I believe that there was this gradual movement away from that. And Abarbanel, I thought, didn't he declare him? He thought he was the Messiah and he was going to be the military conqueror. And he thought it was going to be done through actually intentionally exacerbating this war between Christians and Muslims, and that he would end up being the Messiah on the throne in Jerusalem. I mean, am I wrong on that?
There might be some writings that are disputed, kind of just like Yosef Karo, who had some writings that might be disputed, although the figure himself is accepted as one of the accepted biggest sages in the history of Judaism. And even after the Abarbanel's at the time of the expulsion from Spain, and possibly due to his mentorship, many people, like in Sfat, the people who basically reorganized Judaism after the expulsion in Sfat, Israel, like the Arizal and Yosef Karo and others, possibly were following this lead of the Abarbanel. So there could have been what you're saying is true, but certainly the majority of the Orthodox community, may be the most extreme of like the anti-Zionist Haredi Jews. But my guess would be even among the most anti-Zionist Haredi Jews, that the Abarbanel would be venerated, even if they disagree with him on this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I could also admit that there are probably many wonderful things about Abarbanel and his passion for defending his people, which led him into this kind of bizarre, what I would have thought would be a heresy. Has an admirable side as well as a downside. But to me, post 9/11, what we're seeing now, it's not so much the culmination of somebody like Abarbanel, who's basically still a pious Jew, even with his bizarre messianic millenarian delusions. But the real heretics, the people who are really not believers at all, but who do, in many cases, some of them at least, dabble in black magic. And others are hardcore atheist materialists, but that kind of either Satanists or hardcore materialists. And in either case, they're still rejecting God equally. So they're all really Satanists either way, or whatever. They're opposed to God. So those are the people, as far as I can tell, who are really behind Zionism for the most part. And so I do think that there is a real religious dimension to this. That is, if we believe that we humans, or me, egotistically, me, the individual, or my group, my tribe, has got to triumph over the other individuals or the other tribes, and we're going to do this by taking over the Holy Land and committing genocide there. And we're going to enable this by a massive satanic Freemasonic deception like 9/11. This is evil. I mean, obviously, right?
Yeah, although it could have dispensational unfolding where obviously, like Rabbi Yisrael David Weiss of Notori Cartoon said, okay, you can't steal, you can't kill. You look at what are the Zionists doing? They're stealing and they're killing, and they're using.
God bless him. I love that man.
Yeah, they're using Judaism as a justification for it, and you verse some sort of understanding of the greater nation. So you might have a sage who's resigned to Hashem, to greater spiritual forces, but they're also looking after their flock, and their flock might be largely greedy and atheistic. And so ideas like Zionism is, okay, these people don't really believe in the Torah, the religion. Even like Einstein, talks about, we got to get these people to safety. Anti-Semitism, God forbid, is rising. And, if we could just get our brethren to safety in Israel. And then once you add the religious fervor to it, so like Einstein, who was relatively secularist, but couldn't turn a blind eye relatively to the suffering of the Arabs, that once you add a religious fervor to it and religious explanation, next thing the causing the suffering of the opposing people becomes part of the religion, and something God forbid is celebrated. And if you want to put it down to a blame, like, okay, so okay, like I've read things about the Abarbanel, like you're saying, but I mean generally, okay, the Abarbanel's like a exalted sage. He's considered one of the greatest people in Jewish history. His writing is right next there to Moses, and like when people start wanting to understand Moses better, one of the first things they come on to is the Abarbanel, and the leader. I think that even King Ferdinand was willing to let him stay. He was so important that like the legends told to Jewish kids about him. But you could see the great, maybe like the Lubavitch Rebbe would be a comparison in these days, where it was largely anti-Zionist and recognized the flaws of Zionism, but wanted Jews to be safe, and therefore possibly supported things that you would have been against greater principles of Torah, like you can't kill, you can't steal, you can't ruin the lives of millions of Palestinians.
Well, in Abarbanel's time, you can understand why he would think the way he did, given that the Jews had suffered a huge tragedy on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain and Portugal, and looked like things looked really bad at that moment. And then suddenly there was this interesting kind of clash between the Muslims and the Christians, where the Turks took Constantinople, and then the Muslims were expelled from Spain. All of this, you can understand why, if he's primarily concerned with his own people's destiny, that he would come up with something like he did. And it is rather brilliant. It's just that the way it's played out, this notion of the Muslim versus Christian apocalyptic war may have been dangerous back then, but today it's vastly more dangerous. So it's
ironic that you're rising as a Muslim as one of the biggest voices, anti-war, peace, brotherhood of man, when what they generally tell you about Muslims would be the opposite. That you wouldn't expect from the biggest voices for peace and anti-war to come from the Islamic community. But in some ways, that is the truth. And I don't know how much time you have, or other things you want to discuss, and I also want to ask you about the new Indian state law regarding Islam, maybe part of a greater global move.
Right. Yeah. It's very unfortunate what's happening in India. This is one of the most dangerous situations in the world, with nuclear armed India and Pakistan at each other's throats, and now India being run by a bunch of basically Nazi fanatics who are pushing things in a direction that makes a nuclear war in that part of the world more and more likely. And it wouldn't just affect that part of the world. The calculations about global dimming in the aftermath of a war in which only a few dozen nuclear weapons are used suggest that we might be in for a global catastrophe that could starve tens or hundreds of millions of people, even in a relatively limited nuclear war between countries like India and Pakistan. So it's a very, very bad situation. And it is frustrating to me that I think the stereotype of Muslims as not being peace activists and so on, not being good citizens, is absolutely wrong. Historically, Muslims have not been perfect by any means. But if you look at the general barbarism of humanity, Muslims have, if anything, maybe done a little better than the average non-Muslim. And in today's world, likewise, I mean, in India, all of these alleged radical Muslim terror attacks are virtually all false flags. Elias Davidson, a wonderful man from a Jewish background, has written a book about the Mumbai attacks showing this. And so basically what we see now is Muslims are being scapegoated everywhere, including in India, where people like Modi are building this political movement by hating on and scapegoating Muslims. And this is a process that Rene Girard has described brilliantly. I don't know if you're familiar with Rene Girard's work, but I highly recommend it. I think you would get a lot out of it, David. Of all the people I know, maybe you'd be an interesting person to talk about Girard with, because Girard says that religion and group cohesion in human societies is primarily based on scapegoating and human sacrifice. Right? He says the war of all against all, based on people's mimetic desire. I want what you have. I want what I see you having. I want what you want. I want what I see you wanting. And we're at each other's throats. And the society's about to break down. And then everybody says, look at that bad guy over there. And they go and lynch a scapegoat and blame all our problems on him. Send the scapegoat out into the desert with the sins of the tribe. And this tendency to scapegoat creates the first sacrificial God with a small g. That is the polytheistic gods. The gods of the polytheists are basically these idols that get sacrificed to. And the sacrifice is a memory of a lynching, that is a scapegoating. And so, Muslims are being scapegoated not only in India, they're being lynched regularly in India now, and they're being slaughtered and blinded and mutilated and raped in occupied Kashmir. Similar persecutions going on in Palestine and a lot of other places as well. And a lot of this is in China even. This worldwide scapegoating and persecution of Muslims is being driven by the subliminal effects of the 9/11 mind control operation and the many other false flag events like it, smaller ones, of course, that were used to keep that trope going, to keep that brainwashing system going deep in the minds of the global public. So today, Islam, the pure and correct version of monotheism, is being scapegoated worldwide. So the people of God are being viewed as the Satans who are being persecuted. And at some point, maybe in a process not entirely unlike what happened with the Jewish Holocaust in Nazi Germany, at some point the world's going to wake up and say, oh my God, what have we done? These people that we've been persecuting, this is horrible. And the shame of that may bring on the new dispensation. Just as today's dispensation is global Jewish dominance, thanks to the revision of the view of the Holocaust that sympathizes with the victims. The next global dispensation will be the dispensation of the efflorescence of Islam, based on sympathy with the victims of the ongoing crucifixion of Muslims and the murder of tens of millions of Muslims in the wake of the 9/11 false flag operation.
Awesome. You have time to respond to it. I think we got almost 30 people watching now. if you have time to respond to a few questions in the chat.
Sure, be happy to.
Okay, just if you ever heard of Claire Caw, the London secular Quranist, she's interested in speaking with you. She's a prolific streamer, ethnically Chinese from Malaysia, and she's came up with what she calls secular Quranism, which I have a different interpretation than her, but you're basically would kind of be like a godless ordering of society based on Islamic precedents, where you'd kind of remove the theological aspect of Quran and Allah, but use the Quran as the basis as jurisprudence. So I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this woman, but she's a pretty prolific streamer.
It's a fascinating idea. And, it sounds crazy. Remove God from Quran and use Quran for jurisprudence. But it's crazy enough that it could work in the sense that the reason it would work is because the Quran is divinely revealed, and that's why the Quran is so miraculously in harmony with human nature.
Yeah, it seems interesting. It seems to some extent that that's happening because a lot of Muslims are relatively secular, and maybe subconsciously their jurisprudence largely comes from Islam, even though they're secular. And this guy calls himself Oswald Spengler, because he's a fan of him, and he's curious, I guess, your position on circumcision. He's probably referring to non-Muslims in the West. Does it make sense to you that most adult men of any background in America get circumcised?
Well, this is one area where I question the tradition. That is, it seems to me that circumcision probably, especially early in life, as happens both in Jewish communities and in many American non-Jewish communities, has got to have lifelong traumatic effects, which I cannot imagine them being good. I have read some of the studies on this. There is the bond between mother and child, an infant and child, which Bowlby studied very, very extensively, showed that for people to have secure, peaceful personalities later in life, they have to have basically a secure bond with their mother. And it's been shown that when babies are circumcised, especially in circumstances where the mother's sort of giving the baby up for circumcision and then is aware of the pain that it causes, that this really causes trauma for the mother-child bond and indeed for the infant. And likewise,
there's absolutely no reason for non-Muslims in America to be getting circumcised.
I don't actually. Honestly, I think maybe circumcision is one of those religious customs that all religions ought to be getting past at some point.
Okay, so you got a few questions that are specific. One guy's calling himself G Naza. Not sure. Maybe he follows you, and he's suggesting a debate with you and Dr. Dan Gibson and Jay Smith. I'm not sure if I'm familiar with those people.
Sure, I'll probably debate anybody. Just contact me and tell. I'm at Truth Jihad. It's all run together, lowercase, Truth Jihad @gmail.
Are you familiar with those names, Dr. Gibson or Smith? Jay
Not
Smith?
Offhand. I mean, there are a lot of Gibsons and Smiths I've heard of, but I'm not sure about these ones.
Okay, now I get a lot of alt-right people, probably like the source of the circumcision. So these comments are even being held for Google review, but asking what about the crime statistics in Europe that show that, God forbid, Muslims are doing horrible things criminally in European nations.
Right. And of course, that's been vastly exaggerated. If you look at the actual crime statistics for these various nations, they're much, much safer than the average U.S. American city. So why would Americans even be worried about this? It's a symptom of some kind of derangement. And I think it is the derangement of being brainwashed by Islamophobia, by the 9/11 false flag operation and its various follow-ups. If you take an honest look at crime in Europe, it may be that Muslim or Islamic people from Muslim countries who are immigrants, not all of them are practicing, and certainly the criminals are not practicing for the most part. That those people are somewhat overrepresented in the crime statistics. Yeah, sure, because they're young and they're poor. Duh. This obviously has nothing to do with their religion. And if you want to get rid of crime in these European cities among these groups, the first thing you should be doing is encouraging the building of mosques and attendance at those mosques and Islamic piety. That's the best way to get people into a wholesome way of life and away from crime.
Okay, and this guy Oswald is now asking, does Dr. Barrett think Charles Upton could bring down Dugan given proper exposure? So I've heard of these names, Upton and Dugan, but I don't have any expertise on these guys.
Yeah, I've met both of them, and I admire both of them actually. But they're having a big feud. Well, anyway, yeah, Dugan, of course, is Putin's brain. He's like the hardcore sort of Russian nationalist geostrategist with this bizarre neo-Heideggerian philosophy. And Charles Upton is a brilliant American beatnik poet turned Sufi Muslim who has criticized Dugan and written a book called Dugan Against Dugan. And it's a very interesting battle. If you're interested in intellectual battles, check that out. Could Upton bring down Dugan? I don't know. I mean, Dugan's doing what he's doing, and Upton's critique is probably more convincing for people like me, being a Sufi-oriented Muslim, than it would be to sort of your average secular type. The average secular type would probably find the Heideggerianism in Dugan perfectly fine. I mean, they all, Heidegger is very popular among secular types in American universities. So I don't know. Upton will have his work cut out for him if he wants to take down Dugan among people who are not already of his worldview.
Do you have general opinions on immigration and multiculturalism in the West? Is that something you feel strongly about one way or the other?
Well, I understand the argument that there's too much immigration in the United States. Other countries, I mean, that's the business of each country. I happen to be a U.S. American citizen, so I feel like I'm involved in that and other political debates here in the United States. It's none of my business what France wants to do or what England or Germany or Poland. That's not my business any more than what Ukraine or Yugoslavia or Latvia or Zimbabwe, for that matter. Their immigration policies are their own darn business. And these crazy white nationalists say, oh, my skin color is the same as these guys in Europe, and so I have to hate the immigrants in Europe. That's so stupid. Be an American and get involved in your country and get involved in your immigration debate, not other people's. But that said, I definitely sympathize with people who say there's too much immigration. I think Ron Unz's solution is perfect. Ron Unz says double the minimum wage, ramp down legal immigration, which is the demographic issue. Illegal immigration is not even making a demographic dent on the U.S. It's the legal immigration that's demographically changing the United States. So Ron Unz says double the minimum wage, crank down immigration, lower it, cut it in half or a little less. And that way we can slow the demographic change in the U.S. that is causing social instability, and we can raise up working people to a decent level by doubling that minimum wage. So I highly recommend that. People should go to unz.com, unz.com, and read about Ron Unz's solution to the immigration problem. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I had muted myself. Yeah, Luke Ford, I know, is a big fan of that and advertises, goes over a lot of those articles. I know, like, certainly as a Jew, we have all types of blogs and periodicals. Like, anytime something even borderline anti-Semitic happens, like, it's being pumped through all the papers. And I know from doing these streamings, like the alt-right has became like that with what we might call, I guess, God forbid, jihadi violence against whites. So, so it's like I pop on my YouTube, and like anytime like dark-skinned people beat up someone in Europe, like, I see all these posts about it connected to immigration, multiculturalism, and a lot of it, specifically anti-Islamic in sentiment. I'm not sure if you see a lot of it, or if you think that's somewhat fair or justified that people, make a big deal out of, all these crimes that happen, even if it's, giving a false perception of what's happening.
Well, just as in the United States, I sympathize with people who want to lower immigration in order to slow the demographic changes and to keep a favorable population to resources ratio, which is the best argument against rapid immigration. I can understand why somebody in a European country would feel the same way. But just as in the U.S., I am utterly disgusted by Donald Trump's garbage, vile, racist rhetoric about it. Mexicans are all a bunch of rapists and killers. They're coming for your daughter. What a bunch of garbage. That guy, he should have been shot down, and people should have thrown, feces into his face when he started talking like that. And he said a lot of other things that deserved worse than that. And likewise in Europe, I can understand why somebody would say, we need to change the policy here. This is ridiculous. Maybe we shouldn't have let the Americans drag us into all of these horrific wars that have murdered 27 million Muslims and made tens of millions of other Muslims homeless and turned them into paupers all over the world. Maybe we shouldn't have supported that. Maybe we should have stood up against that. But now that that's happened, maybe we need to realize that we want to slow our immigration rate. Fine. But the way you would discuss that isn't to lie and grossly, vilely exaggerate these atrocity stories. Oh, the dark-skinned jihadi Muslim going after our women. Well, those stories are so exaggerated or invented out of whole cloth by morons who are just driven by hate. Now, I'm not saying they should be censored necessarily, but I do think that you should be allowed to say anything if what you're saying is based on, reason and you're trying to make a persuasive argument. But at some point, it's my friend John Ravuski has argued with me about this. He thinks that I'm too much of a free speech supporter. But he thinks that, he lives in Europe. And he travels all over Europe, and he sees that there's no crime problem anywhere, that the people from Muslim countries are perfectly well behaved, and that, people he knows in these cities where there are these supposed problems are just not even, they don't even think twice about walking on the street at night. So he's just furious about this. He basically wants to go out and lynch all of these racist morons who are making these kinds of inflammatory statements, and at least shut them up and get them off the internet. He doesn't seem to mind the idea of censoring them. I support free speech, so he gets very, very angry at me about this. But I think he does have a point. I can see why he feels that way. Because it's just like in the 1910s and 20s here in the United States, people who yammer about, those black people are constantly raping the white women and lynchings are going on. Well, today, 27 million Muslims murdered around the world by lies about 9/11 and Islamophobic discourses, and you're going to keep, spouting out this sewer and cesspool of lies about Muslims, and drive the equivalent of something a lot worse than the lynching epidemic that happened in the United States. You are much more evil than those creeps back in the 1910s and 20s who were yammering about those black guys going after the white women and driving the lynching epidemic. So you people should be ashamed of yourselves. And I'm talking about, InfoWars people. You know who you are. Paul Joseph Watson.
Yeah, these questions keep on rolling in. Yeah. Just a quick pushback. This guy Jay from London, please stop misquoting Trump. He said they are sending. He probably miswrote, but he would say Trump. I guess he's defending Trump. That's saying it's not that they're all bad or God forbid doing these things, but that they're purposely sending the bad element of their society here, which. Whatever. I got two questions directly.
But let's just talk about facts. The fact is, Ron Unz points out that the crime rates among immigrants and Hispanic immigrants in the United States are lower than among native-born whites. There is no immigration crime problem. The crime rate is lower. So stop talking about that. Talk about something rational.
Yeah, I just thought I'd read that. So I got this guy Oswald again. He's got a whole barrage of questions, and now he's asking your opinion on the DeVos and I guess her brother Prince and what he calls Calvinist Zionism. And I know DeVos is here in Michigan, and Eric Prince was located here in Michigan also. And I'm not so familiar with their global Blackwater military Calvinist Zionism that he's referring to.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not an expert on that. But yeah, this Christian Zionism overall strikes me as even nuttier and much stupider than Jewish Zionism. And Eric Prince is a good embodiment of that.
And someone here said that Matthias Cronquist says regarding Rene Girard, he was wondering if there was anything in Islam that attempts to stop scapegoating and sacrifice, like a parallel to Christianity's Jesus sacrifice story.
That's a brilliant question. Shout out to that questioner. Yeah, exactly. In Islam, for those who aren't familiar with this stuff, Girard says that Jesus's supreme sacrifice was the mechanism that has revealed this scapegoating problem. And so since Jesus, and thanks to the spread of Christianity, humanity is becoming sort of at least aware of its horrific satanic scapegoating nature. And we're learning to sympathize with victims. And maybe it's gone too far as we sympathize with all the LGBTQ so-called victims who aren't really victims, as we sympathize with wealthy Zionists maybe who aren't always victims either. But so the question then is, okay, so Christianity has this mechanism, or this exposure of the scapegoating mechanism that helps to work against it. So we don't hate on and persecute and scapegoat people anymore as much as we used to. Back when public hangings were the main form of recreation. And so does Islam have anything like that? And the answer is absolutely yes. Islam deals with the problem that René Girard identified, which is the problem of unlimited mimetic desire. Everybody wanting what everybody else wants, what everybody else has. And, you know, sexuality is, of course, a big part of this, and so is economics. People want each other's money and each other's sexual gratifications and prestige and social status. So everybody's fighting all the time, and this is what leads to the scapegoating of and the lynching of somebody to solve that problem, according to Girard. So how does Islam mitigate this problem? Well, Islam creates a society where people are at peace. Everybody, not everybody can become a wali Allah, a saint, but everybody can reach the level of a nafs al-mutma'inna, the peaceful soul. And how does Islam foster everybody having peaceful souls, even though our nature is to tend to get into these cycles of unlimited mimetic desire? Well, by one thing, by putting very strict limits on sexuality and sexual expression. That is, marriage is there's no sex. There should be no public sexuality anywhere. Even married people shouldn't even kiss on a park bench. Everybody should be fully covered and modest. Sexuality outside of marriage should be punished, at least theoretically, very, very strongly. So strongly that it's basically unthinkable. And likewise, in terms of economics, anybody who has more than they need should give it away. Anybody who has any wealth beyond the basic subsistence needs has to give away 2% of their net wealth every year. There's a 2% wealth tax on all Muslims. And charity beyond that is very strongly encouraged. It's like potlatch among the Native Americans of the Pacific Northwest. If you have more than you need, either you give it away or you are considered a complete scumbag and you are ostracized completely from polite society. So Islam has this very strong mechanism for keeping mimetic desire under control. So people can be peaceful and they can live peaceful lives. They can go out in public without being tormented by people flaunting wealth and sexuality to get them all excited to fight with each other. Instead, you go outside and there are beautiful gardens and beautiful mosques, and you go sit with your friends in the mosque and you pray, and your spirit soars up, into the sky, into the cosmos. You come back, you have a good meal with your happy family that isn't tormented by all this crap that busts up families in today's Western secular society. And people are walking around with those peaceful souls. And then to remember, just to remind us of this sacrificial nature where we have this thing in us that, used to do this pagan sacrifice thing. Once a year, every year, we celebrate the end of human sacrifice and the inauguration of the Islamic dispensation of the people of the peaceful soul by sacrificing a sheep on Eid. And we have a big feast. And so this is, maybe that gives you at least a sense of how Islam essentially overcomes the problem Girard described and eliminates the need for a sacrificial mechanism. Can't hear you, Duva. You need to unmute.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I just generally have it muting so I don't cause background noise. So Oswald's asking further, why is Girard affiliated with the Hoover Institution? Does that discredit him?
That's an interesting question. I think Girard is he died a few years ago. He's politically naive. He was brilliant in terms of his understanding of history, anthropology, and literature, but politically he was a bit naive, I think, in terms of that wasn't what he really studied. So the Hoover Institute is just this very prestigious academic think tank out of Stanford University, and somebody whose life mission is to revision things in a way that's favorable to traditional conservative institutions in general and Christianity in particular, would likely find a friendly place to be at a place like the Hoover Institute, even though many of the people there would be neocons and there would be various other unsavory types. But given that it's just a big, prestigious conservative think tank, it's not surprising to me that somebody like Girard might end up there.
We had this, I guess, woman, born-again Catholic, butterfly flew away. She calls herself kind of like chastising you for leaving Jesus. And I wouldn't be surprised. I spoke to a lot of Muslims. If you're coming from a Unitarian background, that actually converting to Islam strengthen your relationship to Jesus compared to your upbringing. But if you had came from a more Catholic or some Orthodox strict following of Christianity, did you feel some sort of like, God forbid you abandoned your Lord and Savior Jesus?
Well, no, actually, I found Jesus through Islam. I had a little, taste for the beauty of Jesus before I came to Islam. In particular, I didn't have it when I was growing up, but then when I was 30 years old in 1990, when was that? 1990, 89, 90. I lived in Paris, and I spent a few days reading the Gospels all the way through in French, partly to practice my French and partly to familiarize myself with the Gospels. And it was so beautiful. And so I did have that little taste of the beauty of the Gospels and the story of Jesus before, but it really was not a big part of my life until I came to Islam. And then the Islamic discourse on Jesus, which agrees with Christianity on almost everything, the virgin birth, the Ruh al-Qudus, the Holy Spirit, the fact that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the one who comes back at the end of time, which may be getting pretty close, and defeats Antichrist, which is the system we're living under today, and institutes the reign of peace and love. That is Jesus. So he's Messiah. He's the Holy Spirit born of a virgin, who spoke from the cradle to defend his mother against the calumnies against her, and so on and so forth. It's a very pro-Jesus message, and so I embraced all of that. The part, of course,
that's what you say. So, like, I've never met a Muslim who tired of speaking about Jesus.
Yeah, Muslims love Jesus more than anybody, and it's only now that finally the Muslim groups are starting to get organized. So when somebody insults Jesus, the Muslims stand up beside the Christians and defend him. And Muslims should have been doing this a long time ago. It's really silly for Muslims to get all upset when people insult Muhammad, peace upon him, but not when people insult Jesus, peace upon him. In a way, it's almost more disgusting, because in the Quran, the insults given to Jesus are really, in a sense, the most extreme and repulsive. That is the way he's being insulted. That the insults against his mother are the most repulsive, and he stands up and defends her in the cradle. And so that calumny against Jesus, the kind of obscene calumny against Jesus, which we see in the culture now, is something that Muslims should be the very first people to rise up against.
Yeah, I got quite a few. So Oswald here wants to press you on like race and ethnicity questions about Muhammad or Jesus.
Oh, race and ethnicity, Muhammad and Jesus. Muhammad was sent to the Arabs with a Quranic revelation in clear Arabic, so that the people in his immediate community could understand him. And when we read Quran and the Hadith, but especially Quran, to understand the message, we have to sort of understand that it is coming to this particular community and addressing concerns of that community. And there's this thing about the the asbab, the occasion of revelation. So we need to know that. But the fact that like this race or ethnicity thing is really beyond that not very relevant, because it is a universal message to humanity. He's nothing but a reminder to humanity from the Lord of the worlds. And likewise with Christianity, this whole notion of like Jesus being white, and then Malcolm X seeing the white, Jesus on the wall in prison, and then being told by Elijah Muhammad's people that Jesus is black, and this sort of thing is really pretty silly, given that these prophets of universal monotheism, and I would argue all the true prophetic tradition, including the prophets revered in the Torah, are all giving the same message, which is universal submission to God by humans who are basically equal. And the reason that God created us in different tribes and nations and ethnicities, the Quran tells us, is so we can compete in goodness and so we can get to know one another. So beyond that, those are we're not supposed to compete in a Darwinian sense for survival and so on. We're certainly not supposed to hate on each other. We're supposed to compete in goodness, and we're supposed to try to get to know one another. So all of this is basically a peace, love, why don't we all get along message. It's not a message that religion should be used as a tribal club to beat the other tribe's head with.
Yeah, I guess I got two more questions I want to ask you. I'm not sure your schedule, but it's from my streaming. I've done a lot of debating with people on the JQ, largely from like the alt-right, and so a lot of the people in my chat are just like constantly complaining about what I guess they would see like crimes against white people. And I'm not sure if your audience base or some of the people you deal with causes you to get a constant barrage of people where that's their main concern, and that could be from a variety of forms: pagans, Christians, Zionists. But certainly that there's a disproportionate amount of people in the chat right now who are just like overly concerned with the health of white people in the West. And I don't know if you have some sort of greater message or tying in Islam. And if you had time, I'd like to ask you maybe a little bit about your relationship with Henry Herskovitz, because like I am U of M alumni, and he is probably the single most infamous Jew in all of Michigan.
Okay, well, I'll start with the first question, then get back to Henry. So let's see, what the first question was: crimes against white people.
Just overwhelming concern of kind of my viewership through the debates that I've taken place, like Adam Green or other alt-right figures that I've spoken with, has caused a disproportionate amount of people who watch me. And I'm not sure if you're reading the chat right now on YouTube, but like every other comment is just like, kind of like versions of like, what about the crimes against the whites? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, frankly, this crimes against white people thing strikes me again as being exaggerated and kind of a symptom of a problem. Now, I think there are some real problems. I understand why there is a kind of a white identity movement going on today. I mean, why wouldn't there be? The white people are on the way out as a demographic majority in the United States, and no demographic majority ethnicity is ever going to just fade into that good night without some kind of protest or maybe even try to reverse the process. That's natural and normal. And likewise, the destruction of the white working class, black working class too, to some extent, and other working classes, but the white working class maybe suffered the most spiritually and psychologically from this conscious decision made by globalist elites. And that's not a code word for Jews. I mean, globalist financial elites, and maybe disproportionately Jewish, but certainly not all Jewish. The globalist financial elites consciously decided to destroy manufacturing in the United States. And my father watched a guy from the CFR give a speech to the professors at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the business department, back in 1980 something. And this CFR guy said, we're going to globalize, and all the work's going to be done in the low-wage countries, including all these service jobs that are currently done here in the United States. And American working-class wages are going to drop down to the global level, which at that time was like 2 cents an hour. And my dad raised his hand in the Q&A and said, will working people stand for that politically? And the CFR guy said, they'll have to. They don't have any choice. So this malevolent decision to destroy the white working class and the working class in general in the United States was an abomination. And white people and all working class people should be furious about this. And so that, between the demographic majority disappearing and the destruction of the white working class, which now has the horrible rates of drug addiction and other symptoms of low life expectancy declining and all of these things, I understand why there is a white power, white nationalist, white identity movement out there. It's totally normal that there should be. But my advice would be to go easy on the scapegoating of non-white people. And so talking about crimes against white people implies scapegoating the criminals who are non-white criminals. And I don't think this is really the direction you want to go. If you want to get in a debate about who's committing crimes against whom, the white people who run the United States just murdered 27 million Muslims around the world since 9/11. If you actually witnessed each one of those gruesome deaths one after the other until the full 27 million was accomplished, and then you came back to the United States and watched a similar newsreel of crimes going on one after the other, I don't think it would be necessarily the white people who would be the biggest victims, but getting into these victimization contests are really stupid. The thing about identity politics and its victimization complex is that it's pretty darn stupid no matter who's doing it. And I think that maybe the smarter, more conscious white identity type people should notice this and maybe start working against identity politics in general, and then start working to speak the truth about who's destroyed the white working class and why the white majority is on the way out and how maybe those things could be changed, and do this without scapegoating non-white people.
Okay, yeah, awesome. Appreciate that. So people aren't familiar with Henry Herskovitz, and I'll do a quick
Henry.
screen share and saying I'm U of M alumni, and here is Henry Herskowitz, just like a local wiki, retired engineer, motorcycle enthusiastic alumni of U of M from Pittsburgh. 2003, he founds a group, Jewish Witnesses for Peace, and for over 15 years, he's been standing outside of the Beth Israel congregation in Ann Arbor, protesting, holding up signs, mostly due to calling attention to, God forbid, the horrible human rights violations, things like Remember Darius Sin. But from a Michigan perspective, he's probably the most infamous anti-Semite in Michigan. And if you're just like a simple Jewish person, you're just like, who is this crazy, Jew-hating, horrible man that stands outside of the synagogue, making fun of us? And because I was in Israel and I'm more aware, God forbid, of the horrible human rights violations going on to Palestine, I didn't have any negative inclinations. I've met Henry Herskovitz at the Ford School of Public Policy. President Ford was alumni of University of Michigan, and Sandra Weil, the wealthy Jewish banker, largely paid for it. But there's a Ford School of Public Policy, and they have events pretty regularly. Good speakers, sometimes on Israel. But I've seen Henry Herskowitz; he frequents those events. And but how do you meet him? Where do you stand on certainly his tactics, even if you agree with him, and that people have to know about God forbid, the horrible human rights violations going on in Palestine and on behalf of Israel and American Jews, where we might kind of just be like local liberals, but we're bearing an Israeli flag and we're supporting Israel generally. But where do you come on this? How do you meet Henry Herskowitz? And what do you feel about his optics?
Well, when I first met Henry, my first response was, I don't know about this idea of picketing a house of worship. That just seems like, it seems like there's something dubious about that. Like if everybody starts picketing houses of worship, the thing, it seemed kind of wrong instinctively. But when I got to know him and talked with him more, I ended up admiring him. And I see him as walking in the footsteps of the prophets. The prophets were always people who were rejected by their own communities and especially by the leadership.
I've met him. He's not an observer or scholar of Judaism. So even if you grant him that he's correct about warning Jews about the horrible crimes and disaster that's happening to Palestinians in Israel, I mean, certainly you can't include Henry as a sage. He's not
not a sage, but in my studies of Moroccan Sufism showed that sometimes the holiest people were basically illiterate. I forget, there were a couple of Moroccan saints from the mountains who were like that.
He's not, obviously the guy's an engineer.
I'm not saying he's an illiterate peasant.
He's illiterate about religious Judaism. He might be literate and correct about the disaster that's happening in Israel, But like, I mean, from my knowledge and a few times I spoke to him, he knew extremely little about the religion of Judaism itself.
Mhm.
That's why I just
Right. But
back to
to
you
walk,
saying call him like the prophets, although the prophets might have warned of various things. All of the prophets also warned people about the observance of Mosaic law. So, just because someone's on the right side of social justice, if they're not preaching the Mosaic law, it's hard to include them in, like a prophetic sage category.
yeah, I'm using the term prophet rather, I suppose, loosely, and I guess I'm using it conditioned by my background as being, I embrace the interpretation that the last two prophets were Muhammad and Jesus, peace upon them both, who are universal prophets. Muhammad, peace upon him, was illiterate, or is believed to have been. And so prophecy and then being a scholarly sage are two completely different things, just as being a holy and pious person versus being educated are two very different things. In fact, Leo Strauss and the neocons have a point that often education and learning about rationality can actually cut through the moral bonds, and many people are made worse by becoming more rational, unfortunately. So in any case, Henry, regardless of how brilliant he may be in engineering and how completely uneducated he may be in religion,
it'd be false for me to call him an atheist, but even if he was an atheist, you were saying you would give the same praise even if his personal belief system was more atheistic.
Absolutely, yeah, because I think that, well, in Islam, we believe that people are created with a natural fitra, a human nature, which is basically good. In this, we're very different from Christians. Christians have this tendency to believe in original sin and that the human nature is basically evil, as is all of nature itself, which is one reason maybe why the post-Christian world is paving the earth and making everything so unnatural. But we Muslims believe that nature, and human nature especially, are basically good. And God gave us all the ability to discern right from wrong. Maybe the people who end up as psychopaths, God only gave a grain of sand worth of that ability. And the people who end up as saints, God gave a whole beach full of that ability. But either way, we all got some of it. And so the prophets, in my view, as I understand the Islamic tradition, are people who were inspired by God to tell the truth about the real meaning and purpose of human life, not in philosophical language, but in a very common, straightforward language. Submit to God. Don't do these bad things that you're doing. And Henry has got the second part. Don't do these bad things that you're doing. And maybe, it'd be great if he would also call on the congregation to really submit to God, which implies not doing the bad things that you're doing. But I think that the people who may not have a particular correct religious belief system, but who are still calling out the injustices and the lies and the crimes around them and risking themselves and risking their social standing by telling the mullah, the leaders of the community, that they're doing wrong and risking things to make that brave stance. I mean, to me, that is the essence of prophethood. So yeah, I think Henry is at least walking part of the path of the prophets in what he's doing. And if he can, the more he can purify his heart and just do it for doing right and not get all involved with the ego aspect of it, then the closer he will be to walking the path of the prophets and the saints, if not the sages.
I've seen recently the rise, like If Not Now and Jews for Justice, Voice for Peace movements. And one of the If Not Now, who you're close with Rashida Tlaib, and new movement, protest movement against Jewish institutions, largely based on the occupation. And one of their slogans was like, "You never told us," referring to the occupation, where, if you're just an American Jew brought up and you were kind of fed this fantastic fairy tale vision of Israel, and maybe like the maps didn't even include Palestine, like Israel Day Parade, there's not even a mention of Palestine or Palestinians. It's just this great thing, Israel, that was created. And then students are coming to University of Michigan, they're meeting Palestinians, they're meeting experts in world affairs, and then they're going back to their rabbis, their summer camp leaders, their leaders, and saying like, "You never told us there was an occupation going on. Like, you never told us, God forbid, there were war crimes being committed on our behalf." And, the direction, like the Trump executive order, someone in the chat even asked you to comment on that. But you're just pushing to say, like, you never told us and you never will. We're just going to keep on trying to prevent the facts of what's happening to be told here in America, and we're not going to allow people to make a decision based on the facts, like the propaganda. So, if it's a man like, all people are flawed, and, okay, like I could respect in that sense what he's doing, but it's hard to respect like an atheistic Jew as a, social justice, repair the world type thing. Can you really be an advocate of social justice, repair the world as an atheist? And maybe to some respect, but certainly that message was before its time. And all those people, like, who is this madman that, there's a Jewish anti-Semite, and now you have all these young Jews. It's like, well, how come I wasn't informed about all these crimes being committed on my behalf? And you're coming largely to say, not just like an American Jew who's looking at the crimes that Israel's committing, but possibly due to your embrace of Islam, just to be more aware of the crimes that America is committing around the globe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I kind of see what Henry's doing is a little bit like what I've seen. There have been, some other people who within the Christian community who've had to step outside of it. David Ray Griffin, for instance, was a well-regarded process theologian before he got into 9/11 Truth, and then he started. He tried to get his book published through the Presbyterian Church publishing house, and then they basically rejected him and basically said that we wish you'd never published this guy's book. And there have been a number of others as well. Most recently, I spoke with a guy named John Shuck, who is a Presbyterian minister in Portland, Oregon. And John was censored both by his church, which actually ended up essentially firing him with a severance package, and also his radio station. He had a radio show at KBOO, which is the big alternative listener-sponsored station in Portland. And so he was censored and shut down from both institutions. And as he told me on my show, I was part of the reason, because he started listening to me and he had me on his radio show, and then they censored him. But so he's one of these people who's now thrown out of his church institution for pursuing truth and justice. And so I would say that, Henry, may God lead him to embrace and submit to God and become more theologically correct, but may God also reward him for following his brave and good instincts to speak truth to power. And that is, I think, really what the prophetic tradition is about. I'm kind of, it's interesting. The Jewish community seems, in a way, to have forgotten that its own prophetic tradition is often, if not usually, at odds with its powers that be.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach of, kind of like repair the world, or I sometimes say theologically, Jews have the blood of the prophets flowing through us, that, in theory, we're descendants of the prophets. So the prophet's message, even, so to say, a bad Jew or atheistic Jew, that some aspect of the message of the prophets could be seen through us. And, hence, atheism is extremely dominant among Jews, but at the same time, like repair the world and social justice remains a uniting factor among these atheistic Jews.
Mm-hmm. And I respect what you're doing, David, because I do think that as much as there have been some atheistic and sort of agnostic or non-religious Jews who have done good things and walked in the path of the prophets to some extent, I do think atheism ultimately is a dead end. And pursued rigorously, it ultimately tends to lead to where the neocons have gone with it, which, unfortunately, if that's all you have is this kind of atheist outlook and reason, you do often end up, you're kind of inevitably led down that path of denying the necessity of being spiritual and moral. Well, often you're blind to the spiritual, and then you become rather cynical about the moral, and so you become like Michael Ledeen, saying that Machiavelli he must have been a Jew. He was, because we Jews are so Machiavellian, and Machiavellian therefore was so Jewish. Well, Machiavelli was the guy who followed atheism, or stepped outside of the religious morality of how people should use power. And so today, I think the Jewish community really needs to become less Machiavellian. It needs people who are inspired by God, like the prophets, to stand up and speak truth to power. And so I think you're really on the right path, David, and I respect what you've done, and you've had to stand up against various people in your community as well who don't understand both the genuinely religious side of what you're doing and why you're having dialogue with people like me. So God bless you.
Well, as a religious Jew, I could maintain a Jewish insiders where, like, Henry Herskovitz, even if I agreed with him
Yeah.
theologically, like, he can't go into a synagogue and lead services, so it would make him, like a poster boy for anti-Semitism, self-hating Jew, as opposed to, even if I agreed with him, like, I could still go into synagogue and open up a Talmud, speak some Hebrew, chant with everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Well, but there's one thing that's kind of been gnawing at me about the Jewish community, which is that since I founded the Muslim Jewish Alliance for Truth in 2005, I noticed that among the self-identified Jews who would, in one way or another, come out for 9/11 truth, whether it was Rabbi Lerner or Mark Ellis, the Mark Ellis being the great philosopher of this, prophetic Judaism as opposed to Constantinian Judaism. These people, most of them were non-religious Jews, that is, or barely religious, like Rabbi Lerner. Like Rabbi Lerner was the only rabbi I could find who would even come close to 9/11 truth. And so it was interesting that these people like Elias Davidson, who's, I don't know if he's atheist, but he's totally non-religious, totally secular in his orientation, comes from a Jewish family that escaped the Holocaust to Palestine, and then they left Palestine. People like that were the only ones who would get involved with trying to tell the truth about 9/11. And I would have thought that more religious Jews would be the first. And even Neturei Karta, I've had dealings with Rabbi Weiss. I've met him several times in Tehran, among other places, several other places actually. And he's a great guy. And I can see why he doesn't want to get involved with 9/11. He's got enough on his plate already, as he tells me. But one would think that this great prophetic tradition of Judaism would produce more truth tellers, more people who want to stand up and tell the shocking truth about how corrupt the hierarchy has become. And so I don't know why there aren't more. Why are the synagogues places of such conformity and such stale consensus in favor of evil?
God forbid if it's the flaw of thinking the system is rigged on our behalf. And it's like, okay, if you're a Republican Jew, it's like Trump, he really loves us. And Ivanka Trump, she's a Jew. And
No.
Therefore, like, don't rock the boat, don't spoil things. And historically, Judaism has always kind of had that top-heavy. I mean, people are skeptic, like you mentioned, the Abarbanel and the sages who negotiated these money lending deals in Europe and the church. But I think there's always been, because the Jews are a small enough people where they could try to keep in line the Jews from ruining the agreements that our leadership, so to say, makes with larger society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think
APAC,
Ellis.
like, even if you look into APAC, and he's like, I do not like this organization, but like I've seen politicians, people moving up in politics, and they become avowed APAC supporters because that seems, God forbid, to say, well, the system's rigged in my favor. Thank God. Thank God I'm a Jew and the system's rigged in my favor. Why would I want to ruin that?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I think Mark Ellis is right. That's Constantinian Judaism. It's sort of like, it's equivalent to when Constantine brought Christianity into the Roman government and made it an official religion instead of a persecuted outsider religion. And I think the prophetic tradition is the persecuted outsider tradition, because when you tell the truth, you are going to be an outsider. You're likely to be persecuted. And of course, one of my favorite Jewish sayings, supposedly Jewish sayings, is if you speak the truth, make it funny or they'll kill you. So
I even talked with Patrick Little. I'm not sure if you ever.
Oh yeah, I had him on my show once. Yeah.
So I mean, he mentioned that God forbid, he said Jews are not well liked among the masses. We might have the elites in our favor, but he said from his experience going around the country that in simple America or whatever, the non-elite America, that his message is received very well, as opposed to university official America. That's, I guess he would say, is ran by the elites. Mm-hmm. That I argue like Jews are very popular, saying, but mm-hmm. relatively, so Jews are popular among the elites, and historically, God forbid, I call kind of the boom and bust cycle that is related to our being top heavy or elite, where there's a rise of the masses against us, and the elites could no longer protect us, and that's why people get scared. Like, I don't think Donald Trump's overprotection of the Jewish people is actually going to help us. I think it's going to hurt us, and even the push of these Jewish organizations generally always avoids the masses. It's always about convincing of the elites, and that God forbid, will actually make the situation worse, because it's going to be a mass popular uprising historically against the Jews, as opposed to our inability to have the elites that like us control the masses.
Well, God forbid that there should be any mass lynchings, and that's why I think that we should be work and the problem.
Your own personal perspective is, like, God forbid you're on the short hit list of the ADL, but the Jewish community, it's like, okay, you're giving a narrative that is directly opposite to Zionism, Israeli leaders, mainstream Jewish leaders, Republican advisors, even Democratic Jewish advisors, and therefore you're on the short hit list of the ADL because your narrative is dangerous and counter to the one they're giving. But at the same time, the Jewish community is not at large. They're not really concerned with you and your counter narrative, or so to say, conspiracy theories. They're worried about getting beat up in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
organizations, they're not worried. They put out like a 10,000. God forbid, I follow that pretty closely, kind of like God forbid the whites in my chat are always posting that. But like every time a Jew gets beat up, I see it on one of these blogs, and like the ADL will put up like a $10,000 reward for any leading to this information. But as far as I know, like the ADL's got like a lot of these $10,000, $25,000 rewards out, and we don't know who did anything. And then God forbid if it's in Brooklyn, like you're saying, like it's basically a crime of poverty, and the people that are doing these violence against Jews, they're right out of prison the very next day. And but the organizations saying like, you're our biggest concern, so that's causing a lack of confidence of Jews in these organizations.
Well, I'm actually willing to have dialogue with anybody, including ADL people. And I have
Jonathan Greenblatt on my channel, and I mentioned like I speak to these guys, and he said, he's like, should I speak to these guys? And he spoke to the larger Jewish community in Detroit, and I actually got the first question, and Jonathan Greenblatt's approach was ban them, report them, contact the authorities. But he did acknowledge that I might have success in that venue. So he said, from the ADL's perspective, it's not worth conversing with trolls. Report them, ban them. God forbid, try to ruin their lives. But Greenblatt did say it's possible that I would have success like that.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I've reached out to the ADL a few times and didn't have any luck, and then claim that they reached out to me and I wouldn't respond. In fact, when the ADL got me banned from Canada, and then once I got reinstated, and I did my book tour across Canada, everywhere I went, the ADL was trying to get the event shut down. And then they actually got police officers in plainclothes to come from the hate police squad. And during this whole process, I was trying to talk, this is a B'nai B'rith actually, I was trying to get in touch with them and talk to them and have dialogue with them. And they would, like, there was, I forget her name, there was a woman who was their contact person. I called her many, many times. So, and then they put out these hit pieces on me saying that they tried to reach out to me, but I won't talk to them, presumably because I'm so anti-Semitic. So it's quite disgusting, really, their lack of morality, and that I really don't think that they're doing a good job of preventing intellectuals like me who've strayed from the path of mainstream thought from getting annoyed with them. I mean, if they're trying to make people more angry with them, if they're trying to make people hate them, they're doing a pretty good job. Because it's one thing to have these criminals in New York beating up, but if you get enough angry intellectuals who are pissed off at being mistreated by scumbags at the ADL, that's where you're going to have your problem. So I really think the ADL should be more like you, David. They should be considering like trying some of the people. I think I'm probably one of the most easy people for them to reason with if they wanted to. if they wanted to adopt an honest and balanced and moral approach to things, I would be an easy person for them to reach out to. When I started the Muslim Jewish Christian Alliance for Truth, I was hoping that established Jewish power would see that getting involved with the truth movement would be actually not only good for the truth and in the eyes of God, but it would be good for them, because ultimately, to the extent that the Jewish community and especially the leadership is perceived as being leading the 9/11 cover-up, which is kind of how it looks now. Wow, that, when people wake up to 9/11, which is pretty easy to do, 2 minutes of watching Building 7 and that's it. And then they see that, oh, who's leading the cover-up? It leads to an anti-Semitic narrative, an anti-Jewish narrative, and a lot of people aren't mature enough to deal with that in a rational way. So I really think the ADL strategy that Greenblatt's describing to you is extremely counterproductive in the long run. He might be shutting people down and making their lives miserable and disarming various intellectual opponents in the short run, but it's going to backfire on him. So I hope you win your debate with Greenblatt in the long run.
Well, thank God I got the first question. And, I work together with the ADL. Generally, they're kind of like mostly women. I mean, if you went to a local ADL, it'd mostly be women.
The one I kept calling was some woman in Canada. She's, her voice sounded perfectly nice.
They're kind of like B-rate lawyers and, saying like people that wouldn't have necessarily been so successful in the free market legal realm that work for Jewish charities. And I know from going to mosque, I've been doing interfaiths here with Muslims, basically my whole adult life, but at least 10 years in Metro Detroit. And then in the last few years, organizational Judaism has taken more of an interest in interfaithing. And so the same mosque where I've been going to their events for years, now all of a sudden we got the ADL hosting events with them. And, they kind of have the move over, we're in charge now. But at the same time, God forbid, they don't have a real good grip on the actual community. I'm saying there's a concern among the Jewish people, and obviously, and they don't know necessarily how to deal with it. So we go to legacy organizations like the ADL, and it's tough. There's corruption, and saying, is your narrative so dangerous? Look at you. I'm saying you're a peaceful man, religious man, spiritual man, but your narrative is considered so dangerous that it doesn't even make sense to me. I'm not sure, if the Greenblatt, there's oh, this man is bad. I accept that this man is bad because this group said so.
Mm-hmm. Well, at some point the truth doesn't go away. There's the Quranic line that truth has arrived and falsehood has vanished, and by its very nature, falsehood is bound to vanish. And then there's another line about the truth bashing falsehood's brains out. The truth bashes out the brains of the lies, and so it's kind of like in the ecosystem of information. When there's a big, powerful, high energy space with truth, and then there's a low energy space where it's all lies, which is basically entropy. The high energy from the truth space comes pouring into the low energy entropy space of lies. And this is just a process. You can't do anything about it. So rather than trying to stick your finger in the dike like the ADL is trying to do here and get overwhelmed, which is what's ultimately going to happen sooner or later, be much smarter to join the people who are channeling truth and lowering the entropy of the lies in the culture. It would make things better for all concerned. But anyway, David, I've hit the end of my allotted 2 hours. I've got places to go, people to meet, got having a family mini golf game later today. So I have to run and get prepared for False Flag Weekly News as well.
Okay. Yeah. I really appreciate you having me on. Coming onto my channel, and if you your friend Dr. Ibrahim is available, I'm happy to participate.
Yeah,
in that. I would like
Ibrahim suits you. Yeah. Okay. We'll do that.
I would like
Inshallah,
to do a conversation.
God willing, we'll get you and Ibrahim Sudi on the show, and you can explain to him this thing that's puzzling him about Jewish identity. Is it religious? Is it ethnic? What the heck is it? So, Ibrahim, you'll just have to wait till a couple weeks down the line. We'll schedule that. All right. Well, thank you so much, David. It's really beneficial. Great talking. I love your work. Much respect.
It's beneficial. you could
Okay.
mirror this or just share my link.
Yeah. I'll see if I'll try to mirror it on my channel too and send people your way. You're doing great work. Thanks.
Okay. Have a great day. Appreciate you coming on.
Okay. Thank you. God bless.